Hi there, and welcome to my first tutorial for using the ETCBC database and TextFabric. I wanted to get started by giving a basic introduction to our database resources and to sort of show you around, give you a feel for where everything is coming from. And so I want to start by giving a little bit of history about the database so that you can understand how did this database come to be and what is it? Well, it all started in 1977 with a professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. His name is Eep Talstra. And in 1977, Dr. Talstra began experimenting with using computer databases to study biblical Hebrew syntax. Now, the reason that he did this is because he was motivated by this idea of structuralism and form to function versus function to form. And I don't want to go too far into the methodology here, but the basic idea is that instead of beginning with a syntactic theory about whatever feature in biblical Hebrew that you're studying, you gather as much data as you can about that form and then form a theory about its function. So this is the form to function versus function to form approach. Whereas in this case, the function to form approach is more of a very much traditional way of approaching the language. And this newer way is a completely different method. So in a form of function approach, the whole idea that language has structure and that we can actually exploit that structure to understand what is happening is very important for biblical Hebrew since it's a dead language. So being a dead language, we can't just go and dig up a dead Israelite and ask him, hey, what did you mean when you wrote this? Instead, we have to actually go into the data, look at the data, and figure out for ourselves what's actually happening in the language. And structuralism provides a really nice way to do that. Now, because this structuralism emphasizes formal structure, a very suitable tool for that approach is computational linguistics and computer databases. So if you can imagine, you take all of the Hebrew text in the Hebrew Bible, take every single piece of object, so word objects, phrase objects, clause objects, and sentence objects, and find a way that you can actually tag those objects with information, with attributes about what's happening within those objects, then you can find all kinds of information that you want to access. So, for example, if you want to query word order in the Hebrew Psalms, for example, you could very easily, in this approach with a syntactic database, say, okay, database, please return to me every example where the verb katal occurs after an explicit subject in a clause that is a narrative clause. So this method allows you to pull those examples and then say, okay, database, what are the statistics? So we could say, this is just, I'm just throwing this example out there. In 39 out of 46 cases in, say, the book of Psalms, just probably a very low number, but this phenomenon I just described happens. Well, that's very useful information, and you can take that information and use it for syntactic, grammatical study. And so even if you don't share this approach of this form-to-function methodology, what you should know is that the database itself aims to be sort of agnostic about linguistic theory. And that's the whole beauty of the form-to-function approach. We're not adopting a theory outright and then building a database that essentially is just an echo chamber for our own theory. Instead, the goal, at least theoretically, is to let formal features, observable features, define the data for us. Now, that's not to say that there's no interpretation involved. That is definitely the goal of this approach. But of course, interpretation slips in many different ways in the database. But what you should see in the data is an overall piece of syntactic data where you might get some mixed results, but on the whole, you're getting good stuff. Okay, so what does this mean practically? Well, I wanted to show you an example. And I'm going to use a browser here called the Bible Online Learner. I will, I should have had pulled it up already, but I'll pull it up here. Oh, here it is. Okay. So Bible Online Learner is a outside partner with the ETCBC, and they're using our data here and presenting the data from the database. So this is just Genesis 1, and this is just an example to show you how data is actually stored in our database in a very pragmatic example. So the database stores data as what we call linguistic objects. That's just a fancy way of saying that the different objects at the different levels of the language are stored in the database. So, for example, a sentence is one kind of linguistic object. In fact, that's the biggest object that's stored in the database. The clause is another sort of lower object, and in this case, in Genesis 1, Genesis 1:1, the clause and the sentence, they happen to be exactly the same. In some cases, you may have multiple clauses, though, within a sentence. Within the clause, you have phrases, and within phrases, of course, you have individual words. Now, in each of these linguistic objects, there is data that is stored about those linguistic objects, which we would call object features. So in the case of a clause, for example, we have these very nice features. For example, if you look over on the right, you have the clause type, which in this case tells us that we have a preverbal element, lowercase x, a katal primary verb. In this case, this would be bara. So the preverbal element would be barashit. And then we have an explicit subject in the clause, in this case, the capital X, or Elohim. So this is very valuable information for syntactic research, for discourse linguistics, all kinds of things that you're looking for. Now, I should tell you one more thing, just in passing. The ETCBC data makes a distinction between what we would call distributional and functional data. Distributional data is data that can be identified directly by a computer. It's also data that can be interrupted. So to tell you, give you an example, I don't think there'd be a good one here, but let's say you have a clause, and within that clause you have an intervening relative clause, and a share clause perhaps, and at the other end of that clause you have the rest of the previous clause. So in other words, one clause with an embedded intervening a share clause. In this case, you really technically have two clauses, a large embedding clause and an embedded a share clause. Now, those are functional. In other words, those are things that we can sort of look at as an overview and tell about the data. But for the purpose of the ETCBC, it distinguishes between what we would say clause atoms. So in this case, there would be three clause atoms. So you would have the first part of the clause, which would be clause atom 1. The second part of the clause, which is the a share clause, which is in and of itself its own clause. And then you have the part on the back end outside of the a share clause at the end of the clause, which would be clause atom 2. And together, this all forms one giant clause. But there's distinctions made, these clause atoms, phrase atom distinctions, which you might see if you're looking at the database. And if you're curious of what that means, that's what it is. It's a distinction between functional and distributional information. And if you want to know more about that, then you're free to, I'll throw some links at the bottom for you to read up on that. Okay, so that's the database of the ETCBC. That's the background, where it's coming from. Now, where are we going with this, and why is this relevant, and how can you use this for your own research? Well, recently the ETCBC, as of 2014, started this project called SheBank. And SheBank is maybe something that you're a little more familiar with. This is sort of our, if you want to say, our public face. Here we go. SheBank. And in the SheBank web source, you also have a text viewer, which you can display the information from the data. And also the SheBank project featured the LAF-Fabric. So this was something that was very nice in the past, and that's actually being phased out. But my point is, that the boundaries of what the ETCBC is are changing, because a lot of this is beginning to live online. So that means that we're building a community of people who are interested in linguistic research of the biblical languages, and we are inviting you to join that community. And here are some of the resources that are available for you. And I want to stress in these categories, I place these names in quotes for a reason. So you shouldn't think of it as non-programmers, programmers. Oh, I'm not that kind of person. These aren't classes of people. Okay, programming is a very complicated sounding term, but it's actually not. So if you know how to use biblical Hebrew, if you know how to read a biblical language, you've already learned a language, and programming is like learning that language, except it's a little bit easier. It's actually a lot easier because it's a formal language. So I just wanted to put that out of the way. There's two sources available to you as a non-programmer. You can use SheBank, which I've already shown you. It has an online query system where you can share queries with others. You can view the text, view the data for one or two passages that you're interested in. Same thing with Bible Online Learner. These are fantastic resources if you want to just look at one particular one particular passage. But if you want to start gathering data and gathering information for a specific research question that you have, let's say you're studying phrases in biblical Hebrew. Let's say that you're studying narrative syntax and the role of the katal in the narrative, and you want to gather statistics on that, or you want to display visualizations about that information, then we're going to need something a little more powerful. And this is a completely different idea in, say, biblical studies, theological studies, that you can have programming theologians, programming biblical studies students. Now, whenever I started, to my ears, this sounded almost a little bit tacky, using computers to study the biblical languages or to study biblical studies. I mean, this is humanities, right? This is something that should be an art form. This should be something that I'm engaging only my heart, mind, and soul in. And how does math and algorithms and programming have anything to do with this? Well, if you're studying the biblical language, you should understand that you're essentially studying linguistics, and linguistics is a science. And language functions, it does admittedly function oftentimes unpredictably. But on the other hand, there are very specific patterns within language that computers can help us, can give insight for us to exploit. And also, if you look forward into the future, moving ahead in future research, we have to start providing more data to back up our theories. Okay, so look at the debate on verbal syntax in Greek, biblical Greek, or even in biblical Hebrew. You have a group of people who say, well, I think the verb does this, and another group of people say, well, I think it does this, and each of them bring their own examples to the table. The problem is that these are really not data-driven approaches. So you pick a pet theory, you gather a bunch of resources for that theory, and you bring those resources to the table. And okay, so what? Okay, it's sort of like a bunch of people arguing about theology using these sort of proof texts. Okay, we need a different approach. We need something that's data-driven. Okay, so I've given you all these different examples. These are how the ETCBC and the database resources are being used. But mainly, what I really want to focus on is TextFabric and going forward, how you can use that in your own research. So I put some estimates here. If you're thinking about using this for a particular project or something like that, like I did whenever I was learning, these are some estimates that for me turned out to be true. I got up and running with the then equivalent of TextFabric, which is LAF-Fabric, in about 4 weeks. That's going from zero programming knowledge. I didn't know any Python, which is the resource that the programming language that you will use. I didn't know anything. And in about 4 weeks, I was able to do some very nice queries and searches, look for some statistics and things like that. And MQL is a little bit simpler. It takes about 1 to 2 weeks But in terms of presenting things and gathering statistics, it's not as flexible. It really will just spit out results to you. And unless you have something like Unix background, using things like grep and other text processing tools, you really aren't going to be able to do much with an MQL query. So TextFabric is really your best bet. Before I stop and go to the next video, I wanted to give you an example of just to show you the usefulness of these sorts of resources. So these are features that are stored in the ETCBC on our linguistic objects. So for example, the linguistic object of a word contains a lot of data, actually. So you can pull these consonantal transliterated data. You can pull just the pointed Hebrew. You can pull the part of speech, the phrase-dependent part of speech, and all kinds of things. So I'll just scroll down. Sorry, here's the phrase-dependent part of speech. So something can be a verb, but not actually within a phrase serve as the verb. But the great thing is with this database, you can specify what type of verb or what type of substantive you're looking for. And of course, gender, person, verbal stem, verbal tense. We have our morpheme data, statistics on the frequencies, ranks, and then we have other features. So these are features that are stored on clauses, clause types. We've already looked at one example of those from the Online Bible Learner at Bereshit, the Genesis 1:1, with the ex-katal x. You also have different clause types, clause relationships. So this is actually very helpful. So if you look here at clause-atom relations, in the ETCBC database and also the hierarchical tabulation, clauses have relationships to one another. So they're not these separated, floating, disembodied entities. Clauses share relationships just like phrases share relationships to each other within clauses. Clauses share relationships with each other. So in the ETCBC database, you have mother and daughter clauses, and these relationships, if you want to look at an example of this, you can look at Hino Kalkman's research on the Hebrew verb. There's some really nice data on these relationships of clauses and how those affect syntax in Biblical Hebrew. And with a tool like TextFabric, you can access and exploit all of that data as you want. Okay, and then of course we have phrase features and things like that. So how has this stuff been used? Well, we've been talking a lot about linguistics, but I wanted to give an example that's not exactly linguistic, a little more exegetical. This is a notebook, what we would call a notebook, which is basically an interface that runs inside of your web browser from your computer. So it's not running on the web, it's just using your web browser. And it runs pieces of Python code, and that code is used to pull out or extract the data from the database and manipulate that data, move that data around, look for exactly what you're looking for, and display that data. And in this, notebooks are very nice ways to share your research. Also, if you're using Python, it's much better to use a notebook to learn than, say, doing it on a command line or doing it in an idle where you're having to write the code, save it, run it, write the code, save it, run it. In a Python notebook, you have these little cells here where you can put the code in and run the code. But don't worry about that for now. I just wanted to show you the example here. This is actually a complicated notebook, so also don't be intimidated by it. But this notebook contains parallels, lexical parallels in the Book of Kings. So all these number crunching and things like that, they're actually extracting data from the database, looking for features that are desired. So these if statements, for example, are looking for specific types of features. And then very wonderfully taking all this information and putting out this beautiful graphic. This graphic shows you lexical parallels for key lexical words, content words in the book of Second Kings and Second Chronicles is very fantastic. So something like this is great for exegetical research. Even if you're doing more sort of critical study of the Hebrew text, redaction criticism, or anything like that, looking at how the text has been edited, how it's been finalized, being able to find these sorts of parallels in the text at a macro level, and that's what this is really about, is looking at the text on a large scale and using data to inform how we understand small examples. That's very powerful. Okay, so this is sort of an exegetical example, and here I pulled up the same one. It's the same sort of data, but these are some different visualizations that you can create. It's endless. You can create any kind of visualizations. It really is fantastic. Here's a notebook that was written for Hino Kalkman's work on verbs in Hebrew poetry. And this notebook contains a little bit of other code from a different programming language. But needless to say, being able to organize and query this information and present it in this way, in this case, in this notebook, is where he's providing these translations, for example, is very, very powerful. Okay, and I wanted to provide just a very simple notebook example. So in this notebook, this person, they actually queried the subjects per verse. It's a very simple example of a query, and printed those examples. Psalm 107, 42, we have 8 phrases, we have 2 subjects. They're printing frequency data for each verse. And computer code would actually, this is sort of printing it out line by line, but you could actually add all of this information together if you wanted to analyze it on a larger scale or something like that. So there's a lot more that can be done. Obviously, essentially, it's only limited by your imagination. And really what all this is about is taking research in biblical studies and moving it to a completely different level. This is something that can really change your work, that can really give you a way to search on a large scale for any number of features, organize those that information that you find, present that information in an attractive way. And it's not just about, say, hey, look at these cool things I can do on a computer. I mean, that's I'm not going to lie, that's really fun too. But the best part about this is that this is real data. This is real science. You can use mathematical algorithms and things like that that are already being used for things like natural language processing, for artificial intelligence research, basically exploiting real patterns in the language that computers are well suited for finding, instead of just looking at specific tiny examples on a small scale. So I hope this gives you an example of what you can do with TextFabric, with Shebang, and I hope also that this will prepare you, encourage you to be able to move to the next stage. In the next video, I will help you set up your own environment to run notebooks, and whether or not you know Python at all is completely irrelevant. So I hope to take you through a very basic example, install everything on your machine, and then begin to work with some simple code, very simple code. And if you don't know Python, you can actually learn with me as I give you the examples, and we'll be accessing the database as we go. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me, codyakingham@gmail.com. And also, moving ahead, I'll put our Slack group information on the bottom. If you want access to our Slack group, we have all kinds of tutorial advice that we can give you, and it's a fantastic resource. So let me know if you're interested in joining